Today we have Nathan Bennett. Most of you know him. He's a real homeboy, I would like to say. You've done it all. He was with us, when was it? Not long ago. I was lucky to actually have him as part of Ocean Canada, getting to his last months here at UBC, which was really amazing. Nathan did his PhD UVic, so he's a regional person. He's done everything, postdoc, Washington University, here, research associate. And today, now, actually, what are you? See that thing I'm talking about? I'm not good at all this notes business. Actually, Nathan is the global oceans lead scientist for WWF. So he's done all these things, and that is a serious position, right? Given that he's a social scientist, you would think that that kind of position will be held by a biologist, a fisheries scientist, but hey, we are breaking through, right? The social science, because the human side is important. I like to say we don't need biologists because we manage people, not the fish, right? So we don't need biologists. Eh? Are you going to chase me out of this room? And actually, to tell you, the Volvo Prize winner this year is actually a social scientist. Did you know that? It was announced. Maybe they haven't announced it yet. Oh my gosh. Yeah. But actually, I think it's announced because I wouldn't know it if it wasn't. So, and he's an anthropologist, actually. Eduardo Brondizia is Brazilian, and he's an anthropologist, won the prize. So you can do anything, no matter your field, just put in your heart and soul and you'll be fine. So that's what you are doing now. And one other fact I should announce is there was one outlet here in Canada that actually named Nathan as the top rising star in research in Canada. And this is for all fields, all fields from physics to astronomy, whatever. So this is crazy. How did you do that? Well done, sir. That's good.
Just keep on pushing.
Keep on pushing. He has more than 100 publications already. So this is wonderful. Good to have you. And
great. Thank you so much, Rashid, for the nice introduction, and it's nice to be back here at UBC. Welcome to everybody in the room and also everybody online. I'm going to give a talk today that's probably quite different than most of the talks that happen in the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. I looked through the talks for the last year, and I can see that this is going to bring a real social element and also a real critical element to the discussion around what's happening in the oceans. So I don't need to introduce myself any further. I guess in this talk, I'm going to talk about three things. First, I'm going to talk about the types of social injustices that are being produced by the ocean economy and explore the types of actions needed to address these rampant issues using social theory, so justice theory and systems thinking. Second, I'm going to review the hazards and harms that are producing environmental injustices in the ocean and propose that the recent recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment provides us with a clear guidepost and clear implications for society, governments, and the private sector. And then finally, I'm going to turn to a discussion of the central role and struggles of ocean defenders in safeguarding the marine environment and the human rights of coastal peoples. So in this first section of the talk, I'm going to talk about the social injustices that are occurring in the oceans, and in particular related to the ocean economy, and the potential solutions that emerge using a justice or systems thinking lens. Globally, the oceans are viewed as this new frontier of economic development. Increasing global demand for resources has led to a rapid expansion in the scale and scope of the ocean economy. Jouffret and colleagues call this phenomenon a blue acceleration and show it as occurring across all sectors, from aquaculture to deep sea mining, from shipping to marine tourism, and from offshore winds to marine genetic resources. Many national governments around the world, as well as the private sector, are promoting a blue growth agenda, and corporate actors are trying to capitalize on this growth to increase their profits. The result, of course, is this unprecedented race that's occurring among diverse and competing actors and nations for food, for materials, and space across the global oceans. Yet as these companies and governments race to capitalize on marine resources, blue growth can pose substantial risks for both the environment and for people. The dominant discourse that frames blue growth as beneficial for the economy, for developing nations, for coastal communities, really risks downplaying the potential for both inequitable distribution of benefit and substantial harms or social injustices. This is particularly true as blue growth is often happening in areas of the marine and coastal environment that are used, relied on, and lived in by coastal peoples. Globally, there's an estimated 600 million people who live right on the coast, and upwards of 260 million of those are reliant on fisheries for their livelihoods. Now, concerns about the ocean economy and blue growth are not new. Both civil society organizations and academics have been sounding the alarm about emergent issues related to the ocean economy for some time. Many civil society organizations, such as the World Forum on Fisher People, the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, and the Transnational Institutes, have been pushing it back against ocean grabbing and blue justice issues that are emerging and being perpetrated by blue growth. And this is exemplified by this report from a few years back titled The Global Ocean Grab, and a paper that I published with several collaborators in 2015, where we defined ocean grabbing as dispossession or appropriation of use, control, or access to ocean space and resources from prior resource users, rights holders, and inhabitants. Maniba Isaacs, researchers from the Too Big to Ignore network, and others from around the world have also been documenting environmental and social injustices occurring as a result of past ocean-based economic development activities, including industrial fisheries, aquaculture, oil and gas development, and blue carbon markets, and have issued calls for greater attention to blue justice. Yet, in my view, the risks of social and environmental injustices from blue growth are still insufficiently recognized by those advocating for increases to economic development activities in the ocean. So, to explore this, a group of co-authors and I wanted to delve into the critique and explore past injustices produced by ocean-based economic development through a qualitative review of the literature. The central question guiding our inquiry was simple: what social injustices can result from the ocean economy? We used a qualitative or narrative review approach to allow patterns or themes to emerge from an exploration of the broad literature on the topic. So we conducted an initial systematic review to identify key themes. Then we supplemented that with a narrative review through additional searches to find empirical examples. And I'm not going to delve into all of the categories in this paper, but I just want to highlight the kind of 10 broad categories of risks or social injustices that we identified in this paper. So those risks include the risk of dispossession or displacement in ocean grabbing, environmental justice concerns from pollution and waste, environmental degradation and reduction of availability of ecosystem services, livelihood impacts for small-scale fishers, lost access to marine resources needed for food security and well-being, inequitable distribution of economic benefits, a broad array of social and cultural impacts of ocean development, the marginalization of women, human and indigenous rights abuses, and exclusion from decision-making processes. Now, I want to highlight that even since publishing this paper, I've already highlighted that there's a few things that we missed here. So the health impacts that can come, the social infrastructure impacts that can emerge, the disruptions to human-nature relations that can happen as a result of blue growth. So this is an incomplete analysis and something that still needs to be built on. If you want to read more on this, I encourage you to go to the paper on blue growth and blue justice. But this paper is a critique, but it's not just a critique for critique's sake. Through the critique, we really wanted to raise, highlight the worst case scenario and stimulate a rigorous dialogue about solutions. And so we do touch on the solutions in the back end of the paper. And of course, an obvious starting place for a discussion of solution is to offer the opposite of the 10 social injustices that we identified in the paper as a set of recommendations for avoiding injustices and promoting more just outcomes during blue growth. So following this logic, the review suggests 10 key issues: tenure and access, environmental justice, ecosystem services, small-scale fisheries, food security, economic benefits, sociocultural impacts, gender equity, human rights, and inclusive governance as things that need to be taken into account. And But this is not new. The need to address these issues in development is already highlighted in existing international declarations as well as voluntary agreements, such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights, the voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries, among many others. And it's also codified in corporate social responsibility principles. But at least in the past, most of these high-level agreements and policy documents do not specifically focus on the oceans. So in short, there's really been insufficient attention to norms of inclusiveness and equity in policy deliberations, documents, and guidance related to the ocean economy. Another way of thinking about this is that an explicit social justice framing ought to guide decision-making related to the ocean economy for multilateral governance bodies, for states, as well as for management agencies. And the literature on social justice, environmental justice, just transitions, and just transformation defines 3 dimensions that are useful here: recognitional justice, procedural justice, and distributional justice. And these can be defined as follows. Recognitional justice refers to the acknowledgement of and respect for pre-existing governance arrangements, as well as the distinct rights, worldviews, knowledge, needs, livelihoods, histories, and cultures of different groups in decisions. Procedural justice refers to the level of participation and inclusiveness of decision-making and the quality of governance processes. And distributional justice can be defined as fairness in the distribution of benefits and harms of decisions and actions to different groups. Now, these 3 dimensions of justice can provide us with an overarching decision framework. And under each, in a paper titled Just Transformation to Sustainability, we provide a set of key considerations and practical steps that might guide national or international policy deliberations or specific on-the-ground ocean development activities, ranging from renewable energy to fisheries to aquaculture. If you want to dig more into the practical steps, again, I encourage you to take a look at this paper. But one of the critiques that kind of came my way about some of the ideas that I just presented is that this sort of a managerial or policy approach is really just tinkering at the margin, when what we need is really a transformation of the ocean economy. So myself and a group of co-authors got to thinking about what enables inequity and injustice to persist in the ocean economy. Why is it that we don't only have blue economy models, investments, and activities that are both sustainable and equitable? It is easy to just chalk this up to growing population or increasing demand for resources. But regardless of these pressures, society has options about the economic models, investments, and activities that it allows and promotes. And so, with specific regard to equity and justice issues, we argue that 4 issues are leading to the persistence of a socially inequitable and harmful ocean economy. First, at the root of the problem is an economic paradigm and system that prioritizes growth and profits. Consider, if you will, how GDP is the primary measure of progress. Second, international and national policy meetings, process, and documents give too little attention to equity and justice. Even when there is attention given to equity and justice, is at global oceans-focused meetings, these discussions are often relegated to peripheral side events or small rooms, not to the main stage. Third, the private sector is insufficiently committed to upholding human rights and advancing societal well-being. Corporate social responsibility theory and practice, for example, holds that responsibility is first economic, second legal, third ethical, and finally philanthropic. And given that sort of philosophy, it is not a surprise that both corporate social responsibility and ESG principles often require the minimum necessary to reduce risks to investors' bottom lines. And finally, these economic paradigms, government policies, and private sector frameworks perpetuate harmful and inequitable ocean economy models, investments, and activities on the ground. Newer and more capital intensive and technology-driven forms of economic development bring fewer jobs and economic benefits to coastal communities than small-scale or community-based activities. So in this paper, we draw on systems thinking, and we propose that we need to intervene with transformative actions at these 4 levels: the levels of paradigms, policies, practices, and development models to truly advance a more equitable and just ocean economy. So creating a more equitable blue economy requires first a shift of narratives and paradigms. And this is because the way that government and corporate actors think and talk matters, because norms and narratives can fundamentally shift the way that we eventually formulate policies, practices, and development models. Consider, if you will, the implications of using large ocean states instead of small island developing states, or of focusing on blue economies versus blue communities. These are all narratives that center equity and well-being. And of course, there's also numerous alternative economic paradigms that have been proposed: degrowth economics, post-growth economics, human-centered economy, steady state economics, and prosperity without growth. And of course, there's the donut economics model. And all of these alternative paradigms have tenets such as equity, justice, well-being, care, sufficiency, sustainability, and prosperity at their core, which might foster a more equitable blue economy. A second shift is moving social equity considerations from the periphery to the center of policy meetings, deliberations, and documents related to the ocean economy. At the international level, this means discussions of how to reduce social harms and improve the distribution of benefits should be pervasive in global ocean conferences. Representation of indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers, and other groups in these meetings is also a necessary means to ensure that voices of civil society are representing their own vision. International, regional, and national policy deliberations and documents related to the blue economy should also accentuate the social economy as a key objective and articulate clear recommendations for governments and the private sector. But these documents really need to move from high-level discussions and sets of principles towards tangible actions on how to benefit coastal communities and populations. Third, the private sector needs to shift principles and practices from a minimal protection of human rights to improving human well-being. And there's a huge potential here for the corporate and financial sector to bring greater profits to coastal communities. And partially that's because these sectors are highly concentrated and they require high financial and material inputs. However, this is definitely going to require a shift from doing less harm or doing no harm in order to meet those kind of human rights obligations and reduce risk, towards one of doing more good in order to increase human well-being in coastal communities. And I think for these shifts to actually mean something on the ground, the corporate sector is going to need to commit to more substantive and implementation of corporate social responsibility practices, such as benefit sharing, local hiring and content practices, the creation of community trust funds, et cetera. And the financial sector is going to need to promote greater commitment to the uptake of ESG investment frameworks, but ones that are much more socially aware and ambitious than the current ones that exist. And then a final shift is the identification and scaling up of local and community-based development activities and opportunities. And around the world, of course, there's a huge number of successful examples in various sectors, ranging from fisheries to tourism to aquaculture to renewable energy. Community-supported fisheries is one great example, which has emerged as an alternative marketing and sales model that links consumers to fishers in order to bring greater benefits to local fishers as well as communities. And communities can really be instrumental here through articulating and communicating their own vision for development. Development agencies, governments, and NGOs can also help through helping to advance enabling conditions for successful local development, and through creating financial mechanisms to support these initiatives. So according to systems theory or transformation theory, there's really a greater potential to improve outcomes at the top of the iceberg if we address those underlying issues at the bottom of the iceberg. So that means that we really need to shift paradigms and narratives if we're going to ultimately influence policies, practices, development models, and management actions. But I would argue also that change is required simultaneously at all levels if we're going to get these sort of changes in practices to persist. So that brings me to the second section of my talk. And in this section of the talk, I'm going to really dig into environmental justice issues in the ocean in particular, and the implications of the recent UN recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable ocean. This talk is based on the following paper on environmental injustice in the ocean. So if you want to read more, it's there. I'm going to give you a really cursory overview of it because it's one of those 10,000 word papers with 400 references. So I'll really skirt across the surface of this paper. But before jumping into the paper, I want to give you a bit of background on environmental justice. Environmental justice thinking emerged from US-based scholars, including but not limited to those listed here. And the central focus was on the US. And the emphasis of this early work was really on the racialized impacts of environmental harms and hazards. And in particular, it emphasized the impacts of the siting of industrial developments and the dumping of pollution near Black populations, Indigenous peoples, and other historically and structurally marginalized groups. But since this inception, there's been a really rapidly expanding body of empirical work, and the focus has expanded first away from just focusing on hazards and harms towards also focusing on the distribution of benefits as well as access, for example, to ecosystem services or fisheries or other environmental goods. Second, the focus has expanded beyond distributional concerns to also include recognition and procedural considerations. And so those are those three categories that I defined earlier in the talk. And then third, the thinking has moved from being an analytical framework to one that can be helped to guide decision-making processes on natural resource or sustainable development projects, for example. So overall, the past work, though, has really been terrestrial in focus, and there's been very little attention to the oceans in the environmental justice literature. And so recognizing this gap, a group of co-authors and I set out to understand the scope of the issues. And once again, we conducted a narrative review of the literature. And following the same steps that I outlined earlier, a systematic literature search, and then an identification of the main themes across the literature that we got from the systematic search. And then finally, because there was a real paucity of literature that actually took an environmental justice framing, we needed to dig deeper through additional searches in order to highlight empirical examples. And then, given the relative paucity of this work, although I highlighted how the field has expanded, we really took a traditional environmental justice framing in our review. So we focused on environmental hazards and harms in particular, because that initial review had not been done. So there's five themes that we highlighted. I'll go through each of those really quickly. So the first, and I want to say that all of these themes are biophysical originally, and they're all topics that people focus on here in the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. So the first theme was marine pollution. As everybody here knows, ocean pollution has become one of the most pervasive markers of the Anthropocene ocean. No corner of the world's ocean is immune to the long-range transport, persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxic nature of pollutants, including persistent organic pollutants such as PCBs, dioxins, furans, DDTs, and metals. There's also catastrophic oil spills and nuclear disasters that add to the chemical assault. And despite command and control efforts, there's a chemical pollution cocktail from point source and non-point sources that continues to be discharged into the ocean. Together, these oceans pollutants impair the health of ocean species, fish, megafauna, and biodiversity. And this siege of ocean pollution also jeopardized various aspects of human well-being and coastal populations, including health, livelihoods, and human rights. And one insight here from the environmental justice literature is that, just like on land, historically marginalized and racialized groups that rely on subsistence harvesting or small-scale fishing, and low-income nations tend to be disproportionately exposed to and impacted by increasing chemical and biological contamination in the ocean. The second theme that came out of our review was around marine plastics. And in the ocean, plastics account for as much as 80 to 95% of global marine debris. And at a global scale, it's estimated that 4.8 to 12.7 million metric tons is discharged into the ocean annually. 80% of that comes from land-based sources and the other 20% from ocean-based sources. Plastics are ubiquitous. There are numerous different types and sizes from macro to micro. They deteriorate and fragment into nanoparticles that persist. As much as 99% of plastics don't sit on the surface, but rather sink into the water column or onto the seafloor. And they circulate globally around the ocean to certain regions and accumulate in certain areas, such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Plastics, of course, impair the marine environment in a variety of ways, including being ingested by marine life, changing growth and reproduction of marine organisms, reducing the functioning of ecosystems and productions of services, and simultaneously they can impact human health and well-being. For example, humans can ingest fish or microorganisms that have previously ingested plastics. And of course, there's also substantial economic harms that come from plastics for the tourism industry, for the fishing industry, and for the fishing sector. And here, once again, plastic pollution is shown in the literature to disproportionately affect groups who are economically or politically marginalized. And plastics have this real global dimension, with 73.9% of plastics being produced by 15 countries that simply ship their waste elsewhere for processing and recycling. A third theme is around climate change. And of course, we know that climate change is producing numerous and substantial changes in the marine environment, including ocean warming, acidification, changing weather patterns, extreme events, and sea level rise. And these lead to knock-on effects on fish productivity and distribution, growth and health of ecosystems such as coral reefs, flooding and saltwater intrusion into coastal areas, and the blooms of macroalgae. And this litany of direct and indirect climate change effects also has implications for coastal populations. So extreme weather events, coastal inundation and erosion, saltwater intrusion, marine heat waves, acidification, these have substantial economic effects on fisheries, on aquaculture, on agriculture, as well as in tourism. And they also have impacts on food security, community infrastructure, ecosystem services, community health and rights. And there's a substantial evidence in the literature of the different ethnic, racial, gender, and age and socioeconomic groups really experience these impacts of climate change in a very different ways. And certain geographies and regions of the world are also more or less impacted by these changes. Theme number 4 is environmental degradation. At a global scale, there's increasing pressure on and declines in ecosystems as well as biodiversity. So 50% of salt marshes, 35% of mangroves, 30% of coral reefs, and 19% of seagrass meadows have been lost or degraded. Of course, human consumption and activities are the primary driver of environmental degradation. And of course, this in turn reduces marine ecosystem services, which provide food and medicine, livelihood opportunities and income, carbon sequestration, defense against extreme weather events. They make contributions to cultural heritage and provide many other benefits. So as these different ecosystem services decline, so too does human well-being in coastal populations. And finally, fisheries declines. At a global scale, wild fish stocks are in decline. This is driven by a variety of different factors, including overfishing, illegal fishing, destructive fishing methods, and inadequate fishing measures. And these declines in wild fish stocks directly threaten the livelihoods, food and nutritional security, and cultural practices of the millions of people who rely on fisheries daily. However, just like all of the other hazards and harms that I highlighted, the impacts of fisheries declines are not equally distributed across the world. With small-scale fishers, resource-dependent coastal communities, large ocean states, and lower-income nations often bearing the heaviest burdens. So in addition to identifying the 4 themes, and we also explored a handful of cross-cutting insights that emerged from this review. So there's four insights that I want to draw out. So the first is that these various hazards and harms that we identified in this paper do not exist in isolation. As anthropogenic activities increase and pressures on the oceans converge, they interact and accumulate for coastal populations. For example, nutrient runoff from agriculture and urban centers can combine with warming oceans to increase the size of dead zones. Second, the overlap of interactions and of hazards and harms in the ocean and coastal environment can also lead to cumulative human exposures to environmental injustices with magnified impacts for different aspects of human well-being. For example, climate disasters such as storms, hurricanes, and floods often lead to increased exposure to infectious diseases, as well as to chemical pollutants. A third insight from the review is that the exposure to and impacts of environmental hazards are socially differentiated across axes of identity, including gender, age, ethnicity, race, class, and livelihoods. For example, women disproportionately bear the impacts of climate change, ecosystem service degradation, as well as fisheries declines. But I do want to say that, within this literature review, one of the things that we found is that most of the literature focuses on a single axis of identity, and we found relatively few intersectional analyses. And then finally, the review highlights how environmental hazards and harms are unevenly geographically distributed, highlighting both the localized and globalized nature of environmental injustices in the ocean. For example, at a local scale, exposures and social impacts are worse for coastal communities that are situated near polluting marine industries, near marine sacrifice zones, near urban centers, near plastic-laden rivers, or areas where nutrient runoff or sewage outflows are higher. But on the other hand, many of these issues are really global, with issues being produced far from the source. So here you can think about the knock-on effects of climate change. You can think about the example I provided earlier around the production of plastics in 15 countries, and then those waste being shipped elsewhere. Similar dynamics exist, of course, in the fishing industry. Now, how do we address these issues aside from some of the direct governance mechanisms that we could focus on for addressing these issues, or the corporate sector-led mechanisms? I want to just highlight the potential for human rights doctrines to address these environmental justice issues. This notion of environmental human rights is premised on the idea that humans are entitled to a set of universal and inalienable human rights that are fundamental to dignity, security, as well as thriving. And the global human rights doctrine, that started with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, recognizes a number of different categories of human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, civic and political rights, as well as fundamental rights. There's also specific declarations and conventions that recognize the rights of specific groups, such as women, children, marginalized groups, or the rights of indigenous people and small-scale fishers. And then, one really important point here is that, it wasn't until very recently that this fundamental human right to a clean and healthy environment was recognized by the United Nations. So that just happened in 2022 when they passed a resolution recognizing this fundamental right. And this right applies to everyone, everywhere, and in all environments, including the ocean. It has very specific implications enshrined in the law itself, in terms of actions need to be taken by society for the environment, in terms of obligations for governments, and also in terms of responsibilities for the private sector. I don't have time to go into those here, but if you want to read a little bit more about that, you can check out this paper on ocean defenders and human rights, which digs into some of those obligations and responsibilities. So much of the thinking that I've discussed here really focuses on the role of the state, as well as management agencies and the private sector in addressing injustices in the ocean. But the last kind of little bit of my talk, what I want to talk about is the role of civil society. What is the role and struggles of local ocean defenders in safeguarding the marine environment. And here, I'm just going to really quickly go through this topic and then introduce you to a project that I'm working on and the website related to that, if you want to learn a little bit more. So this topic of environmental defenders is one that's received a lot of attention in recent years from international organizations. And this is kind of the most prominent definition. It refers to individuals or groups who in their personal or professional capacity and in a peaceful manner strive to protect and promote human rights relating to the environment. And they recognize that land and environmental rights are interlinked and often inseparable. One thing you'll note in this definition is the lack of attention to the oceans. So what do we know about environmental defenders? We know that there's this increasing global demand for resources, that the demand for resources is moving into peripheral regions where rural populations and indigenous populations are present. And as a result, this is leading to a lot of conflict. And of course, you know, when that happens and when violations of human rights emerge in these various places, people rise up in opposition and trying to defend their environment and their rights. And what we also know is that there's at the same time, there's increasing threats to violence against and murders of environmental defenders in various places around the world. And we also know that most of the assassinations of human rights defenders, so of all human rights defenders in the world, are of environmental defenders. So a full 69% in 2022 of human rights defenders that were murdered were environmental defenders. But what about in the ocean space? You know, are we neglecting ocean defenders? The short story here is that definitions, policy documents, research, advocacy, and supports for environmental defenders often neglect to give much attention to what's happening in the ocean space. They neglect to bring it up in the policy documents. Most of the research focuses on the terrestrial environment, and as a result, most of the financial and policy level supports that are going to environmental defenders neglect ocean defenders. So noting these gaps, a few colleagues and myself started to explore this topic of ocean defenders, and we've written a couple of papers, and we've also started to define terms and launched a global project on this. So first, what's an ocean defender? So we define ocean defenders as the individuals, groups, or communities who mobilize, advocate, or take action to protect the marine environment, their coastal and oceanic territories, and associated human rights against existential threats. You know, understandably, you know, when development activities are happening in coastal areas and populations' lives, livelihoods, territories, environment are being threatened by that, they're going to rise up in opposition. Why is this happening? Well, we've already gone through that earlier in the talk. First of all, you know, there's this rapid acceleration of blue growth at the coastal margin and in peopled seas. And of course, when this growth is left unchecked and not properly managed, it's going to produce a range of social injustices, environmental injustices, as well as human rights issues. So that gets at the what and the why. What about where, who, and how? So first of all, because development is happening everywhere, these injustices and human rights issues are also happening everywhere in the ocean. And so this map from the Environmental Justice Atlas documents environmental justice conflicts around the world. And what you're going to see with the dots is that so many of them are happening at the coastal margin. So ocean defenders, well, they're active everywhere in the world because of these rampant environmental justice issues. I'll just skip through that one. So our initial analysis focused around small-scale fishers, partially because there's you know, a lot of documentation of resistance efforts by these groups. But the groups active in this space are also much broader. It includes individuals and collectives of coastal communities, local citizens, small-scale fishers, Pacific Islanders, indigenous peoples, women, as well as even youth groups who are active in opposing and defending the ocean. And our initial research shows that these groups are using a variety of different actions. They're mobilizing social networks for collective action. They're organizing protests and occupations. They're researching and documenting the issues. They're communicating with the media. and they're raising awareness of the public. They're advocating for policy change and corporate social responsibility. They're also often engaging in lengthy legal battles and engaging in local monitoring and enforcement efforts. But these groups are also not working alone. They're often working in collaboration with broader networks of allied organizations, including legal, media, research, and civil society organizations. What about silencing criminalization, threats, and attacks and murders of ocean defenders? Well, this story here is that, similar to environmental land defenders, there's definitely worrying evidence that they're being silenced, criminalized, threatened, and experiencing acts of violence and getting murdered for their work to protect the ocean environment. And there's cases all around the world where both governments and corporate sector actors are the ones that are contributing to these issues. So these are just a couple of examples here, but there's a much longer list. And I would hazard a guess that probably just as many, if not more, deaths and murders are happening in the ocean environment related to ocean defenders as are happening on land. And I would say that because everywhere that I work in the world, I know at least one or as many as 10 cases of ocean defenders who've been murdered over time. And those examples are missing from the record books. So I'm not going to go through the summary there. That's just summarizing what I just told you. All of this to say, just recognizing the scale of this issue and the gaps in everything from knowledge to practice. Myself and some others started a project called the Ocean Defenders Project with the overarching goal of increasing knowledge of, raising the profile of, and bringing greater support to local ocean defenders. We've kind of got a strategy laid out to move from research to outreach to improving action on the ground to support ocean defenders, and a number of activities and outputs that we're working on over the next few years. The first thing that we're really focusing on right now is documenting a global set of case studies from all over the world. We're slowly loading those up onto this website. And then in the coming year, we'll be launching some high-level reports. Later this month on November 29th, we'll be doing a global webinar hosted by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we have a number of other activities planned. So if you're interested, jump on the website and you can check out some more information about those case studies, read a little bit more about specific examples. And if you want to learn more, also the IUCN webinar will be coming up later in the month. And of course, this is a big collaborative project involving many individuals, and the text is too small to read there, so don't bother. That brings me to the end. Thanks so much for listening. That was a bit of a whirlwind tour. I wanted to bring together just some diverse sets of topics that I've been working on over the last few years that really got at this issue of environmental and social injustices in the ocean and the types of solutions that we might employ to address some of those issues, focusing both on the role of governments, private sector, as well as thinking about what civil society is already doing and how we can augment the activities that they're taking. Yeah, fantastic question. So the question is first of all, this highlighting that there's many different types of organization that have been complicit in human rights abuses, including economic or private sector organizations, as well as NGOs at a global scale, and that includes the organization that I currently work with, WWF. There's been some exposés recently around past abuses in projects where WWF works, and then the question was really around, do I see a role for civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations in raising the profile of and addressing human rights abuses? Did I get that fairly accurately? So, I mean, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, human rights, this recognition of human rights has been around for a really long time. And globally, the vast majority of countries, although not all countries, have signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or onto UNDRIP, or onto other human rights conventions and agreements. But those laws and policies, they're something that applies not just to governments. They also apply to other organizations, and that includes the private sector, but other civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations who are domiciled in countries that have agreed to those things. And even if countries haven't agreed to those things, those human rights doctrine and this agreement to in terms of environmental human rights, those are broadly agreed upon agreements that provide guidance to all actors in the world. So then, to this question of do civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations have a responsibility to follow these globally agreed norms and practices? Absolutely. They have a responsibility to. Do they have a responsibility to follow due diligence practices and adopt environmental and social safeguards frameworks and have established grievance mechanisms? Absolutely. They should absolutely do that. Have civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations tried to address some of these issues that have emerged? And yes, they have. Do they have further to go? Yes, they do. So I could talk a lot more about this topic for sure. I think we're probably still touching the surface in terms of our ultimate obligations as non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. So there's lots more to do in this space, and I hope that WWF will become a leader in that space, but it's already done quite a bit of work to address. It's one of the reasons that they choose to hire people like myself, who's a social scientist who critiques some of the human rights issues that are happening in the ocean, because they want to bring that expertise on board in terms of thinking about how to address those issues. Yeah, so that particular language refers to not so much to governance practices or systems that are put in place by governments or the private sector within a place. That phrasing refers mostly to the types of governance systems, for example, that Indigenous groups might have in place for the management of their own resources, the types of stewardship practices that they might engage in. So rather than coming in with an externally driven model that says we understand the action that should be taken in that place, and we understand the way that decisions should be made in that place, recognizing how decisions are made in that place, what is culturally and socially appropriate, the types of actions that are taken, and bringing those on into whatever model is taken up in that place, whether it's fisheries management or biodiversity conservation. Yeah, I forgot to summarize the previous question, and I'll see if I can summarize this one. This question is around the rapid consolidation of the blue economy and the various sectors in the coastal space. And then the question was really around what sorts of actions can we take to address this consolidation. Well, some of that was sort of touched on in some of the points I raised earlier on in the talk, although again at a super high level and in a very cursory way. I think there's definitely actions that can be taken in sectors that are highly resource intensive and concentrated, and that kind of need to be that way because of how much money it takes to develop those industries. And that's largely through corporate social responsibility practices and principles, right? To ensure that coastal communities have benefits and are receiving those benefits. Of course, there does need to be some sort of accountability and oversight for those mechanisms in order for them to work. That's our experience from the past. A second point here would be that governments also have a really big role in promoting benefit sharing mechanisms and other mechanisms that might bring greater benefits to coastal communities. So recognition of rights is a really big one. Ensuring that there are financial mechanisms and flows from those sectors to coastal communities, that's another one. And then, many other organizations also have ways that they can support this through, supporting local development efforts, et cetera.